Hello, my friends. Happy New Year. Today is the 30th. I hope you have had a very good Christmas and you will have a very, very happy New Year. All my best wishes to you. I was in town today in Oxford and yesterday. I went to Mass at the Oratory, and then I was quite surprised to see that the Oxfam Secondhand bookshop, which is very near in the same street, was open, being Sunday. And I went in, and my goodness, when I go into a secondhand bookshop, I just go a little bit wild because everything is like, really good books. Old books, old editions, and they cost you like £2 and £3 and so on. So I have to, after a while, I have to kind of stop. Come on, because I can't even carry them on the bus. But I'll just give you an idea of what I got. Well, first of all, you will not see it because it doesn't, I don't know, but this is I Claudius, okay, Robert Graves, and it's a hardback, and this is from 1934, okay, and it's in very good condition. You know what I got it for? I got it for £4. Okay, let me show you. I'm just going to share this. This is going to be a light. Okay, how about Anthony Burgess' The End of the World News, and this is about the 20th century and the revolutions and the Trotskyists and the everything else, okay? And this is from 1958, I believe, and this cost me £3. Okay, how about this one? The Life of Hilaire Belloc. This is fantastic, and this is from 1958 too. And it takes you, I've started reading it, and Quiet Homes, The Growing Pains, his life, all right? And how much did that cost me? £3. £3. All right. Then I've got a few more here. Okay, I won't go. Five Tales, John Goldsworthy. Okay, I got that for £2. They had a lot, quite a few books by Charles Kingsley. Didn't know. I had never read Charles Kingsley. I haven't read him yet, but I have been looking him up, and I see that one of the things that everyone agrees with is that he was really, really anti-Catholic. So I'm looking forward to reading him. But the one that I am reading at the moment is this little book, and you've all heard of it, Eminent Victorians by Lytton Strachey. And this is from which year? 1929. I've got that little book for £3. Okay, so I had heard of this book. I know it is very famous, and he's supposed to be a very good writer. I didn't know much about him, but again, I have been reading about him. The four eminent Victorians that he covers here are Cardinal Manning, Florence Nightingale, Dr. Arnold, and the end of General Gordon. Okay, so I started reading about Cardinal Manning. And Cardinal Manning was one of those 19th century, okay, with John Henry Newman, although according to this author, they were real enemies, but part of the came to be known as the Oxford movement or the Tractarian movement. John Henry Newman, now a saint, people who actually converted to Catholicism, but it wasn't very easy for them to do so. Cardinal Newman, la crème de la crème of the Church of England at the time, very famous for his writings and his sermons in Oxford, St. Mary's Church, University Church, and everything. They posed themselves the question that, yes, the Church of England was Protestant, but they felt that in doctrine, yes, the separation from Rome, Henry VIII, all that, fine. But nevertheless, in doctrine, that they hadn't really accepted the other doctrinal changes that other Protestant denominations had accepted. They felt, that in doctrine, it was actually quite Catholic, that in doctrine, never mind the Pope, in doctrine, there wasn't a lot of difference there. And so they thought, okay, so going back to Rome, no way, thank you. Actually, Newman said in his most desperate times when he felt, no, we will not go back to Rome, he said something like, you might have us one by one, but you will never, Rome, have us all of us all together. Anyway, so it wasn't a question of going back to Rome, but it was a question of the doctrine actually is not that different, except don't know whether we agree, because the Eucharist, for example, is not accepted, but some do. So he was trying to see if there could be a via media, he called, that, the Church of England could be separated from Rome, but nevertheless be the same thing from their Anglo-Catholic or High Church or things like that, okay? So Lytton Strachey goes, I'm just beginning, but he deals quite a lot with the fight between John Henry Newman and Cardinal Manning. So John Henry Newman eventually came into the church, so did Cardinal Manning. Obviously he wasn't a cardinal at the time, he was a churchman, a Church of England, and both of them came over, as they said, okay? But he goes a little bit into the animosity, especially that Cardinal Manning had towards Newman. Now, I know because I have checked this author, and they tell us quite a few examples of how, when he's writing history, he's actually writing a historical novel, in the sense that in many cases he just makes things up, or he just exaggerates things, and they give examples and so on. So, but in any case, it's a good read as to what might have been happening, and I'm going to take you to that. And the Tractarian movement as such. He says with Cardinal Manning, okay, let me start. The history of the Victorian age will never be written. We know too much about it. For ignorance is the first requisite of the historian, ignorance which simplifies and clarifies, which selects and omits, with a placid perfection unattainable by the highest art. Concerning the age which has just passed, our fathers and our grandfathers have poured forth and accumulated so vast a quantity of information that the industry of a Ranke would be submerged by it, and the perspicacity of a Gibbon would quail before it. It is not by the direct method of a scrupulous narration that the explorer of the past can hope to depict that singular epoch. If he is wise, he will adopt a subtler strategy. He will attack his subject in unexpected places. He will fall upon the flank or the rear. He will shoot a sudden revealing searchlight into obscure recesses, hitherto undivined. He will row out over the great ocean of material and lower down into it, here and there, a little bucket, which will bring up to the light of day some characteristic specimen from those far depths, to be examined with a careful curiosity. Guided by these considerations, I have written the ensuing studies. So it's going to focus in specific things without giving you the whole story. I have to say that this author also was a homosexual at a time, at the beginning of the 20th century, at a time when it really had to be hidden, although he didn't actually hide it that much. He had many lovers, and one of them was actually Keynes, the economist. But so when it comes to Newman, he's going to attack him. And you can see where all that is coming from. But in any case, okay, guided by these considerations, I have written the ensuing studies. I have attempted, through the medium of biography, to present some Victorian visions to the modern eye. They are, in one sense, haphazard visions, that is to say, my choice of subjects has been determined by no desire to construct a system or to prove a theory, but by simple motives of convenience and of art. It has been my purpose to illustrate rather than to explain. It would have been futile to hope to tell even a précis of the truth about the Victorian age, for that would fill innumerable volumes. But in the lives of an ecclesiastic, an educational authority, a woman of action, and a man of adventure, I have sought to examine and elucidate certain fragments of the truth which took my fancy and laid to my hand. I hope, however, that the following pages may prove to be of interest from the strictly biographical, no less than from the historical point of view. And then he says, how many lessons are to be learned from them? Many, but it is hardly necessary to particularize, to preserve, for instance, a becoming brevity, a brevity which excludes everything that is redundant and nothing that is significant. That surely is the first duty of the biographer. The second, no less surely, is to maintain his own freedom of spirit. It is not his business to be complimentary. It is his business to lay bare the facts of the case as he understands them. He's trying to say that he's being objective, but as he understands them. This is what I have aimed at in this book, and to lay bare the facts of some cases as I understand them, dispassionately, impartially, and without ulterior intentions. there are ulterior intentions. You can see it almost immediately. He disliked them both, Newman and Manning. One, Newman, he portrays as a little bit of, I wouldn't say an idiot, but a sort of a weak masochist, which he was not. And Manning, he is the usual, ecclesiastic who's involved in politics and that sort of, well, he was, but his own interpretation, his own views come into it very, very much. But he says no ulterior intentions. To quote the words of a master, I impose nothing, I propose nothing, I simply expose. Wonderful. I think it was a Frenchman who said that, but in any case. Okay, so Cardinal Manning, very interesting about these two individuals and what went on. Two individuals very famous, two individuals very highly regarded in the Church of England, who in the 19th century, middle end of the 19th century, came over to Rome, as they say. So let me see. Henry Edward Manning was born in 1807 and died in 1892. His life was extraordinary in many ways, but its interest for the modern inquirer depends mainly upon two considerations: the light which his career throws upon the spirit of his age, and the psychological problems suggested by his inner history. He belonged to that class of eminent ecclesiastics, and it is by no means a small class, who have been distinguished less for saintliness and learning than for practical ability. The priest or the bishops who involved themselves in politics. Had he lived in the Middle Ages, he would certainly have been neither a Francis nor an Aquinas, but he might have been an Innocent. As Pope Innocent. As it was, born in the England of the 19th century, growing up in the very seed time of modern progress, coming to maturity with the first onrush of liberalism, and living long enough to witness the victories of science and democracy, he yet, by a strange concatenation of circumstances, seemed almost to revive in his own person that long line of diplomatic and administrative clerics which, one would have thought, had come to an end forever with Cardinal Wolsey. Okay, so he would be involved with the workers, he would be involved okay, so undoubtedly what is most obviously striking in the history of Manning's career is the persistent strength of his innate characteristics. Through all the changes of his fortunes, the powerful spirit of the man worked on undismayed. It was as if the fates had laid a wager that they would daunt him, and in the end they lost their bet. His father was a rich West Indian merchant. He was English, but in the West Indian Company, West Indian merchant, a governor of the Bank of England, a member of Parliament, that was his father, who drove into town every day from his country seat in a coach and four, and was content with nothing short of a bishop for the christening of his children. Little Henry, like the rest, had his bishop, but he was obliged to wait for him for as long as 18 months. In those days, and even a generation later, as Keble bears witness, he's going to deal with Keble, he never converted. Keble and Pusey and later on C.S. Lewis never actually left the Church of England. He's going to deal with them. There was a great laxity in regard to the early baptism of children. The delay has been noted by Manning's biographer as the first stumbling block in the spiritual life of the future cardinal, but he surmounted it with success. So he's going to deal first with with Manning, way before he later on converts to the Catholic Church as a member of the Church of England. His father was more careful in other ways. His refinement and delicacy of mind were such, his father wrote Manning long afterwards, that I never heard out of his mouth a word which might have not been spoken in the presence of the most pure and sensitive, except, he adds, on one occasion. He was then forced by others to repeat a Negro story which, though free from all evil, the sexu was indelicate. He did it with great resistance. His example gave me a hatred of all such talk. The family lived in an atmosphere of evangelical piety. One day the little boy came in from the farmyard, and his mother asked him whether he had seen a peacock. I said yes, and the nurse said no, and my mother made me kneel down and beg God to forgive me for not speaking the truth. That is Manning from his own autobiography. At the age of 4, the child was told by a cousin of the age of 6 that God had a book in which he wrote down everything we did wrong. This so terrified me for days afterwards that I remember being found by my mother sitting under a kind of writing table in great fear. I never forgot this at any time in my life, the Cardinal later will tell us, and it has been a great grace to me. When he was 9 years old, he devoured the Apocalypse, and I never all through my life forgot the lake that burneth with fire and brimstone. That verse has kept me like an audible voice through all my life and through worlds of danger in my youth. At Harrow, the public school, the worlds of danger were already around him, but yet he listened to the audible voice. At school and college I never failed to say my prayers, so far as memory serves me, even for a day. And he underwent another religious experience. He read Paley's Evidences. It's a famous book, the evidence for the world being created by God, that there is a God. I took in the whole argument, wrote Manning, when he was over 70, and I thank God that nothing has ever shaken it. Yet, on the whole, he led the unspiritual life of an ordinary schoolboy. We have glimpses of him as a handsome lad playing cricket or strutting about in a tassel Hessian top boots, and on one occasion at least he gave proof of a certain dexterity of conduct which deserved to be remembered. He went out of bounds, and a master, riding by and seeing him on the other side of the field, tied his horse to a gate and ran after him. The astute young youth outran the master, fetched a circle, reached the gate, jumped onto the horse's back, and rode off. For this he was very properly chastised, but of what use was chastisement? No whipping, however severe, could have eradicated from little Henry's mind a quality at least as firmly planted in it as his fear of hell and his belief in the arguments of Paley. It has been It had been his father's wish that Manning should go into the church, but the thought disgusted him. And when he reached Oxford, his tastes, his ambitions, his successes at the Union all seemed to mark him out for a political career. He was a year junior to Samuel Wilberforce and a year senior to Gladstone, the Prime Minister. In those days, the Union, the Oxford Union, was the recruiting ground for young politicians. Ministers came down from London to listen to the debates. And a few years later, the Duke of Newcastle gave Gladstone a pocket borough on the strength of his speech at the Union against the Reform Bill. To those three young men, indeed, the whole world lay open. Were they not rich, well-connected, and endowed with an infinite capacity for making speeches? The event justified the highest expectations of their friends, for the least distinguished of the three died a bishop. The only danger lay in another direction. "Watch, my dear Samuel," wrote the elder Wilberforce to his son. "Watch, my dear Samuel, watch with jealousy whether you find yourself unduly solicitous about acquitting yourself, whether you are too much chagrined when you fail, or are puffed up by your success. Undue solicitude about popular estimation is a weakness against which all real Christians must guard with the most jealous watchfulness. The more you can retain the impression of your being surrounded by a cloud of witnesses of the invisible world, to use the scripture phrase, the more you will be armed against this besetting sin." But suddenly it seemed as if such a warning could, after all, have very little relevance to Manning, for on his leaving Oxford, the brimming cup was dashed from his lips. He was already beginning to dream of himself in the House of Commons, the solitary advocate of some great cause whose triumph was to be eventually brought about by his extraordinary efforts, when his father was declared a bankrupt, and all his hopes of a political career came to an end forever. It was at this time that Manning became intimate with a pious lady, the sister of one of his college friends, whom he used to describe as his spiritual mother. He made her his confidant, and one day, as they walked together in the shrubbery, he revealed the bitterness of the disappointment into which his father's failure had plunged him. She tried to cheer him, and then she added that there were higher aims open to him which he had not considered. "What do you mean?" he asked. "The kingdom of heaven," she answered. "Heavenly ambitions are not closed against you." The young man listened, was silent, and said at last that he did not know, but she was right. She suggested reading the Bible together, and they accordingly did so during the whole of that vacation, every morning after breakfast. Yet in spite of these devotional exercises, and in spite of a voluminous correspondence on religious subjects with his spiritual mother, Manning still continued to indulge in secular hopes. He entered the colonial office as a supernumerary clerk, and it was only when the offer of a Merton Fellowship, that's Merton College in Oxford, the offer of a Merton Fellowship seemed to depend upon his taking orders. So a fellowship, you had to be a member of the Church of England, to depend upon his taking orders that, a cleric, that his heavenly ambitions began to assume a definite shape. Just then he fell in love with Miss Deffel, whose father would have nothing to say to a young man without prospects, and forbade him the house. It was only too true. What were the prospects of a supernumerary clerk in the colonial office? Manning went to Oxford and took orders in the Anglican Church. He was elected to the Merton Fellowship and obtained, through the influence of the Wilberforces, a curacy in Sussex. At the last moment, he almost drew back. "I think the whole step has been too precipitate," he wrote to his brother-in-law. "I have rather allowed the instance of my friends and the allurements of an agreeable curacy in many respects to get the better of my sober judgment." His vast ambitions, his dreams of public service, of honours and of power, was all this to end in a little country curacy, agreeable in many respects? But there was nothing for it. The deed was done, and the fates had apparently succeeded very effectively in getting rid of Manning. All he could do was to make the best of a bad business now. Accordingly, in the first place, he decided that he had received a call from God, ad veritatem et ad seipsum, and in the second, forgetting Miss Deffel, he married his rector's daughter. Within a few months the rector died, and Manning stepped into his shoes. And at last it could be said that the shoes were not uncomfortable. For the next 7 years he fulfilled the functions of a country clergyman. He was energetic and devout. He was polite and handsome. His fame grew in the diocese. At last he began to be spoken of as the probable successor to the old Archdeacon of Chichester. When Mrs. Manning prematurely died, he was at first inconsolable, but he found relief in the distraction of redoubled work. How could he have guessed that one day he would come to number that loss among God's special mercies? Yet so it was to be. In after years, the memory of his wife seemed to be blotted from his mind. He never spoke of her. Every letter, every record of his married life he destroyed. And when word was sent to him that her grave was falling into ruin, "It is best so," he answered. "Let it be. Time effaces all things." But when the grave was yet fresh, the young rector would sit beside it day after day, writing his sermons. In the meantime, a series of events was taking place in another part of England, which was to take a no less profound effect upon Manning's history than the merciful removal of his wife. In the same year in which he took up his Sussex curacy, the Tracts for the Times had begun to appear at Oxford. The Oxford movement, in fact, had started on its course. The phrase is still familiar, but its meaning has become somewhat obscured both by the lapse of time and the intrinsic ambiguity of the subjects connected with it. Let us borrow for a moment the wings of historical imagination and, hovering lightly over the Oxford of the 30s, that is the 1830s, take a rapid bird's-eye view. For many generations, the Church of England had slept the sleep of the comfortable. The sullen murmurings of dissent, the loud battle cry of revolution had hardly disturbed her slumbers. Portly divines subscribed with a sigh or a smile to the 39 Articles, sank quietly into easy livings, rode gaily to hounds of a morning as gentlemen should, and, as gentlemen should, carried their 2 bottles of an evening. To be in the Church of England, was in fact simply to pursue one of those professions which nature and society had decided were proper to gentlemen, and gentlemen alone. The fervours of piety, the zeal of apostolic charity, the enthusiasm of self-renunciation, these things were all very well in their way and in their place. But their place was certainly not the Church of England. Gentlemen were neither fervid nor zealous, and above all they were not enthusiastic. They were, it was true, occasionally to be found within the Church some straight-laced parsons, or the high Tory school, who looked back with regret to the days of Laud, or talked of the apostolical succession. And there were groups of square-toed evangelicals who were earnest over the atonement, confessed to a personal love of Jesus Christ, and seemed to have arranged the whole of their lives, down to the minutest details of act and speech, with reference to eternity. But such extremes were the rare exceptions. The great bulk of the clergy walked calmly along the smooth road of ordinary duty. They kept an eye on the poor of the parish, and they conducted the Sunday services in a becoming manner. For the rest, they differed neither outwardly nor inwardly from the great bulk of the laity, to whom the Church was a useful organization for the maintenance of religion, as by law established. The awakening came at last, however, and it was a rude one. The liberal principles of the French Revolution, checked at first in the terrors of reaction, began to make way in England. Rationalists lifted up their heads. Bentham and the Mills propounded utilitarianism. The Mills' father rather than John Stuart Mill, although he did start there, but then he moved away from utilitarianism. But in any case, Bentham and the Mills propounded utilitarianism. The Reform Bill was passed, and there were rumours abroad of disestablishment. Even churchmen seemed to have caught the infection. Dr. Whately was so bold as to assert that in the interpretation of Scripture, different opinions might be permitted upon matters of doubt. And Dr. Arnold drew up a disquieting scheme for allowing dissenters into the Church, though it is true that he did not go quite so far as to contemplate the admission of Unitarians. At this time there was living in a country parish a young clergyman of the name of John Keble. There is a college in Oxford, Keble College. He had gone to Oxford at the age of 15, where, after a successful academic career, he had been made a fellow of Oriel College. All right. He had then returned to his father's parish and taken up the duties of a curate. He had a thorough knowledge of the contents of the prayer book, the ways of a common room. Common room is where in an Oxford college, people get together to talk, to have a coffee. It's the meeting room, yes? So you have the junior common room where undergraduates meet, and the senior common room, that's where you discuss things in a relaxed way. So he had a thorough knowledge of the contents of the prayer book, the ways of a common room, the conjugations of the Greek irregular verbs, and the small jests of a country parsonage. And the defects of his experience in other directions were replaced by a zeal and a piety which were soon to prove themselves equal, and more than equal, to whatever calls might be made upon them. The superabundance of his piety overflowed into verse, and the holy simplicity of the Christian year carried his name into the remotest lodging-houses of England, and for his zeal, however, it needed another outlet. Looking forth upon the doings of his fellow men through his rectory windows in Gloucestershire, Keble felt his whole soul shaking with loathing, anger, and dread. Infidelity was stalking through the land. Authority was being laughed at. The hideous doctrines of democracy were being openly preached. Worse still, if possible, the Church herself was ignorant and lukewarm. She had forgotten the mysteries of the sacraments. She had lost faith in the apostolical succession. This is all the Church of England, you understand, yeah? She was no longer interested in the early fathers, and she submitted herself to the control of a secular legislature, the members of which were not even bound to profess belief in the atonement. In the face of such enormities, what could Keble do? He was ready to do anything, but he was a simple and an ambitious man, and his wrath would in all probability have consumed itself unappeased within him, had he not chanced to come into contact at the critical moment with a spirit more excitable and daring than his own. Harold Froude, one of Keble's pupils, was a clever young man to whom had fallen a rather larger share of self-assurance and intolerance than even clever young men usually possess. Let me read that again. Was a clever young man to whom had fallen a rather larger share of self-assurance and intolerance than even clever young men usually possess. What was singular about him, however, was not so much his temper as his tastes. The sort of ardor which impels more normal youths to haunt music halls and fall in love with actresses took the form, in Froude's case, of a romantic devotion to the deity and an intense interest in the state of his own soul. He was obsessed by the ideals of saintliness and convinced of the supreme importance of not eating too much. He kept a diary in which he recorded his delinquencies, and there were many. "I cannot say much for myself today," he writes on September the 29th, 1826. He was 23 years old. "I did not read the Psalms and second lesson after breakfast, which I had neglected to do before, though I had plenty of time on my hands. Would have liked to be thought adventurous for a scramble I had at the Devil's Bridge. Looked with greediness to see if there was a goose on the table for dinner." These were all his sins at the age of 23. "And though what I ate was of the plainest sort, and I took no variety, yet even this was partly the effect of accident, and I certainly rather exceeded in quantity, as I was muzzy and sleepy after dinner. Another example of what he wrote: I allowed myself to be disgusted with so-and-so's blank's pomposity. He doesn't write the name. He wrote that a little later. Also smiled at an allusion in the lessons to abstemiousness in eating. I hope not from pride or vanity, but mistrust. It certainly was unintentional. And again, as to my meals, I can say that I was always careful to see that no one else would take a thing before I served myself. And I believe, as to the kind of my food, a bit of cold endings of a dab at breakfast and a scrap of mackerel at dinner are the only things that diverge from the strict rule of simplicity. I am obliged to confess, he notes, that in my intercourse with the Supreme Being I am become more and more sluggish. And then he exclaims, Thine eye trieth my inward parts, and knoweth my thoughts. Oh, that my ways were made so direct that I might keep thy statutes. I will walk in thy commandments, when thou hast set my heart at liberty. Such were the preoccupations of this young man. Perhaps they would have been different if he had had a little less of what Newman describes as his high, severe idea of the intrinsic excellence of virginity. But it is useless to speculate. Naturally enough, the fierce and burning zeal of Keble had a profound effect upon his mind. The two became intimate friends, and Froude, eagerly seizing upon the doctrines of the elder man, saw to it that they had as full a measure of controversial notoriety as an Oxford common room could afford. He plunged the metaphysical mysteries of the Holy Catholic Church into the atmosphere of party politics. Surprised doctors of divinity found themselves suddenly faced with strange questions which had never entered their heads before. Was the Church of England, or was it not, a part of the Church Catholic? If it was, were not the reformers of the 16th century renegades? Was not the participation of the body and blood of Christ essential to the maintenance of Christian life and hope in each individual? Were Timothy and Titus bishops, or were they not? If they were, did it not follow that the power of administering the Holy Eucharist was the attribute of a sacred order founded by Christ himself? Did not the Fathers refer to the tradition of the Church as to something independent of the written word and sufficient to refute heresy, even alone? Was it not therefore God's unwritten word? And did it not demand the same reverence from us as the Scriptures, and for exactly the same reason, because it was his word? The doctors of divinity were aghast at such questions, which seemed to lead they hardly knew whither, and they found it difficult to think of very opposite answers. But Hurrell Froude supplied the answers himself readily enough. All Oxford, all England should know the truth. The time was out of joint, and he was only too delighted to have been born to set it right. But after all, something more was needed than even the excitement of Froude combined with the conviction of Keble to ruffle seriously the vast calm waters of Christian thought. It was the genius of John Henry Newman. If Newman had never lived, or if his father, when the gig came round on the fatal morning, still undecided between the two universities, if they had chanced to turn the horse head in the direction of Cambridge rather than Oxford, who can doubt that the Oxford movement would have flickered out its little flame unobserved in the common room of Oriel College? And how different, too, would have been the fate of Newman himself. Newman was a child of the Romantic Revival. A secret spirit dwelt apart in delectable mountains. An artist whose subtle senses caught, like a shower in the sunshine, the impalpable rainbow of the immaterial world. In other times, under other skies, his days would have been more fortunate. He might have helped to weave the garland of Meleager, or to mix the lapis lazuli of Fra Angelico, or to chase the delicate truth in the shade of an Athenian palestra, or his hands might have fashioned those ethereal faces that smile in the niches of Chartres. Even in his own age he might, at Cambridge, whose cloisters have ever been consecrated to poetry and common sense, have followed quietly in Gray's footsteps, and brought into flower those seeds of inspiration which now lie embedded amid the faded devotion of the Lyra Apostolica. At Oxford he was doomed. He could not withstand the last enchantment of the Middle Age. It was in vain that he plunged into the pages of Gibbon, or communed for long hours with Beethoven over his beloved violin. The air was thick with clerical sanctity, heavy with the odours of tradition, and the soft warmth of spiritual authority. His friendship with Harold Froude did the rest. All that was weakest in him hurried him onward, and all that was strongest in him too. His curious and vaulting imagination began to construct vast philosophical fabrics out of the writings of ancient monks, and to dally with visions of angelic visitations and the efficacy of the oil of Saint Walburga. Now he's going to try to make fun of the where he's going to end up in the Catholic Church, and all those superstitions of saints and statues and so on. I will spare you all that because it's not even funny, but anyway. If Newman had died at the age of 60, today he would have been already forgotten, save by a few ecclesiastical historians. But he lived to write his Apologia, and to reach immortality, neither as a thinker nor as a theologian, but as an artist who has embalmed the poignant history of an intensely human spirit in the magical spices of words. Okay, the Apologia Pro Vita Sua was his book about how he eventually ended up in the Catholic Church, because there were doubts, because many people were saying that it was because of this reason, the other reason. Even Catholics in Rome could not trust him very much, certainly in England, and so he had to write his reasons, and that is the book. Okay. Let me see, I'm going to jump a little bit, let me find it. Okay, when Froude succeeded in impregnating Newman with the ideas of Keble, he uses certain words. I'm sure he's smiling when he's using things like impregnating and penetrating and things like that. It is very obvious. Okay, so when Freud succeeded in impregnating Newman with the ideas of Keble, the Oxford movement began. The original and remarkable characteristic of these three men was that they took the Christian religion au pied de la lettre, verbatim. This had not been done in England for centuries. When they declared every Sunday that they believed in the Holy Catholic Church, they meant it. When they repeated the Athanasian Creed, why does he call him the Athanasian Creed? Yes, Saint Athanasius was at that time being persecuted so many times. You remember I have 2 or 3 videos on him against the Arian heresy and so on. But the person who was at the Nicene Council, the cardinal there was Hosius, at the age of 101, who actually wrote it, and they all said placid. So he calls it the Athanasian Creed for some reason, I don't know. But in any case, when they repeated the Athanasian Creed, they meant it. Even when they subscribed to the 39 articles, they meant it, or at least they thought they did. Now, such a state of mind was dangerous, more dangerous indeed than they at first realized. They had started with the innocent assumption that the Christian religion was contained in the doctrines of the Church of England. But the more they examined into this matter, the more difficult and dubious it became. This is the process, how they're going to... The Church of England bore everywhere upon it the signs of human imperfection. They began to see things that they hadn't seen before. It was the outcome of revolution and of compromise, the Church of England, of the exigencies of politicians and the caprices of princes, of the prejudices of theologians and the necessities of the state. How had it happened that this piece of patchwork had become the receptacle for the august and infinite mysteries of the Christian faith? This was the problem with which Newman and his friends found themselves confronted. Other men might, and apparently did, see nothing very strange in such a situation. But other men saw in Christianity itself scarcely more than a convenient and respectable appendage to existence, by which a sound system of morals was inculcated, and through which one might hope to attain to everlasting bliss. To Newman and Keble it was otherwise. They saw a transcendent manifestation of divine power flowing down elaborate and immense through the ages, a consecrated priesthood stretching back through the mystic symbol of the laying on of hands to the very Godhead. A whole universe of spiritual beings brought into communion with the eternal by means of wafers, he says. A great mass of metaphysical doctrines, at once incomprehensible and of incalculable import, lay down with infinite certitude. They saw the supernatural everywhere and at all times, a living force, floating invisible, he's being sarcastic, floating invisible in angels, inspiring saints, and investing with miraculous properties the commonest material things. Okay, so he's smiling, he's, a little bit of a satiric, ironic smile at what they believe. But in any case, no wonder that they found such a spectacle hard to bring into line with the institution which had been evolved from the divorce of Henry VIII, the intrigues of Elizabethan parliaments, and the revolution of 1688. They did, no doubt, soon satisfy themselves that they had succeeded in this apparently hopeless task. But the conclusions which they came to, in order to do so, were decidedly startling. The Church of England, they declared, was indeed the one true church. But she had been under an eclipse since the Reformation. In fact, since she had begun to exist. She had, it is true, escaped the corruptions of Rome, but she had become enslaved by the secular power and degraded by the false doctrines of Protestantism. So that is how they saw it. The Christian religion was still preserved intact by the English priesthood, but it was preserved, as it were, unconsciously. A priceless deposit, handed down blindly from generation to generation, and submitting less by the will of man than through the ordinance of God, as expressed in the mysterious virtue of the sacraments. Christianity, in short, had become entangled in a series of unfortunate circumstances from which it was the plain duty of Newman and his friends to rescue it forthwith. What was curious was that this task had been reserved in so marked a manner for them. Some of the divines of the 17th century had perhaps been vouchsafed glimpses of the truth. But they were glimpses and nothing more. No, the waters of the true faith had dived underground at the Reformation, and they were waiting for the wand of Newman to strike the rock before they should burst forth once more into the light of day. The whole matter, no doubt, was providential. What other explanations could there be? Okay, so you can see how he's looking with an ironic eye to the questions, but he's going to, that Newman was and the others were facing, but he's going to come into this. The first step, it was clear, was to purge the Church of her shames and her errors. The reformers, the original reformers, the reformers must be exposed. The yoke of the secular power must be thrown off. Dogma must be reinstated in its old preeminence. And Christians must be reminded of what they had apparently forgotten, the presence of the supernatural in daily life. It would be a gain to this country, Keble observed, were it vastly more superstitious, more bigoted, more gloomy, more fierce in its religion than at present it shows itself to be. The only good I know of Cranmer, that was the original reformer, said Harold Freude, was that he burnt well. Newman preached, and soon the new views began to spread. Among the earliest of the converts was Dr. Pusey, a man of wealth and learning, a professor, a canon of Christ Church College, who had, it was rumoured, been to Germany. Then the Tracts for the Times, the magazine, the tracts, were started under Newman's editorship, and the movement was launched upon the world. The tracts were written, quote, with the hope of rousing members of our church to comprehend her alarming position. as a man might give notice of a fire or inundation to startle all who heard him." End of quote. They may be said to have succeeded in their object, for the sensation which they caused among clergymen throughout the country was extreme. They dealt with a great variety of questions, but the underlying intention of all of them was to attack the accepted doctrines and practices of the Church of England. Dr. Pusey wrote learnedly on baptismal regeneration. He also wrote on fasting. His treatment of the latter subject met with considerable disapproval, which surprised the doctor. "I was not prepared," he said, "for people questioning, even in the abstract, the duty of fasting. I thought serious-minded persons at least supposed they practiced fasting in some way or other. I assumed the duty to be acknowledged and thought it only undervalued." We live and learn, even though we have been to Germany. Other tracts discuss the Holy Catholic Church, the clergy, and the liturgy. One treated of the question of whether a clergyman of the Church of England be now bound to have morning and evening prayers daily in his parish church. Another pointed out the indications of a superintending providence in the preservation of the prayer book and in the changes which it has undergone. Another consisted of a collection of Advent sermons on Antichrist. Keble wrote a long and elaborate tract on the mysticism attributed to the early fathers of the Church, in which he expressed his opinions upon a large number of curious matters. "According to men's usual way of talking," he wrote, "it would be called an accidental circumstance that there were 5 loaves, not more nor less, in the store of our Lord and his disciples wherewith to provide the miraculous feast. But the ancient interpreters treated it as designed and providential. In this, surely, not erring. And their conjecture is that it represents the sacrifice of the whole world of sense, and especially of the old dispensation, which, being outward and visible, might be called the dispensation of the senses, to the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, to be a pledge and means of communion with him according to the terms of the new or evangelical law. This idea they arrived at by considering the number 5, the number of the senses and the mystical opponent of the visible and the sensible universe. He goes on to let's see. In due course, a little bit more about the tracts, and in due course the tracts made their appearance at the remote rectory in Sussex, where Manning was. Manning was some years younger than Newman, and the two men had only met occasionally at the university, but now, through common friends, a closer relationship began to grow up between them. It was only to be expected that Newman should be anxious to enroll the rising young rector among his followers, and on Manning's side there were many causes which impelled him to accept the overtures from Oxford. He was a man of a serious and vigorous temperament, to whom it was inevitable that the bold, high principles of the movement should strongly appeal. There was also an element in his mind, that element which had terrified him in his childhood, with apocalyptic visions, and urged him in his youth to Bible readings after breakfast, which now brought him under the spell of the Oxford theories of sacramental mysticism. And besides, the movement offered another attraction. It imputed an extraordinary, a transcendent merit to the profession which Manning himself pursued. The cleric was not as his lay brethren. He was a creature apart, chosen by divine will and sanctified by divine mysteries. It was a relief to find, when one had supposed that one was nothing but a clergyman, that one might after all be something else. One might even be a priest. Accordingly, Manning shook off his early evangelical convictions, started an active correspondence with Newman, and was soon working for the new cause. He collected quotations and began to translate the works of Tatus for Dr. Pusey. He wrote an article on Justin for the British Critic, Newman's magazine. He published a sermon on faith with notes and appendices, which was condemned by an evangelical bishop and fiercely attacked by no less a person than the celebrated Mr. Bowdler. The sermon, said Mr. Bowdler in a book which he devoted to the subject, was bad enough, but the appendix was abominable. At the same time, he was busy asserting the independence of the Church of England, opposing secular education, and bringing out pamphlets against the Ecclesiastical Commission, which had been appointed by Parliament to report on church property. Then we find him in the role of a spiritual director of souls. Ladies met him by stealth in his church and made their confessions. Over one case, that of a lady who found herself drifting towards Rome. On this case, he consulted Newman. Newman advised him to enlarge upon the doctrine of 1 Corinthians 7. Also, I think you must press on her the prospect of benefiting the poor church, through which she has her baptism, by stopping in it. Does she not care for the souls of all around her, steeped and stifled in Protestantism? How will she best care for them? By indulging her own feelings in the communion of Rome, or in denying herself and staying in sackcloth and ashes to do them good? Whether these arguments were successful does not appear. For several years after his wife's death, Manning was occupied with these new activities, while his relations with Newman developed into what was apparently a warm friendship. But as time went on, the situation became more complicated. Tractarianism began to arouse the hostility not only of the evangelical but of the moderate churchmen, who could not help perceiving in the ever-deepening Catholicism of the Oxford party the dread approaches of Rome. The Record newspaper, an influential evangelical journal, took up the matter and sniffed popery in every direction. It spoke of certain clergymen as tainted, and after that, preferment seemed to pass those clergymen by. A change here, they would not be promoted. They had gone too far. Too much popery. Okay, so the fact that Manning found it wise to conduct his confessional ministrations in secret was in itself highly significant. It was necessary to be careful, and Manning was very careful indeed. The neighbouring Archdeacon, Mr. Hare, was a Low Churchman. Manning made friends with him, as warmly, it seemed, as he had made friends with Newman. He corresponded with him, asked his advice about the books he should read, and discussed questions of theology. As to Galatians 6:15, we cannot differ. With a man who reads and reasons, I can have no controversy, and you do both. Archdeacon Hare was pleased, but soon a rumour reached him which was, to say the least of it, upsetting. Manning had been removing the high pews from a church in Brighton and putting in open benches in their place. Everyone knew what that meant. Everyone knew that a high pew was one of the bulwarks of Protestantism and that an open bench had upon it the taint of Rome. Mr. Manning hastened to explain. "My dear friend," he wrote, "I did not exchange pews for open benches, but got the pews, the same in number, moved from the nave of the church to the walls of the side aisle, so that the whole church has a regular arrangement of open benches, which irregularly existed before. I am not today quite well, so farewell, with much regard, yours ever, H.E.M." Archdeacon Hare was reassured. It was important that he should be, for the Archdeacon of Chichester was growing very old, and Hare's influence might be exceedingly useful when a vacancy occurred. So, indeed, it fell out. A new bishop, Dr. Shuttleworth, was appointed to the see, and the old archdeacon took the opportunity of retiring. Manning was obviously marked out as his successor, but the new bishop happened to be a Low Churchman, an aggressive Low Churchman, who went so far as to parody the Tractarian fashion of using saints' days for the dating of letters. Yeah, always in Catholic culture also you would say Ascension Day, 1824, whatever. So the same day, yeah, that was the tradition. So obviously these Tractarians were using the same tradition, and and this guy actually ridiculed them for doing that, for dating the letters, and he used to write "the palace, washing day" at the beginning of his. The palace is obviously where he lived. Yeah, the palace, washing day. And what was equally serious, his views were shared by Mrs. Shuttleworth, who had already decided that the pushing young rector was tainted. But at the critical moment, Archdeacon Hare came to the rescue. He persuaded the bishop that Manning was safe, and the appointment was accordingly made, behind Mrs. Shuttleworth's back. She was furious, but it was too late. Manning was now an archdeacon. All the lady could do to indicate her disapprobation was to put a copy of Mr. Bowdler's book in a conspicuous position on the drawing-room table where he came to pay his respects at the palace. Among the letters of congratulation which Manning received was one from Mr. Gladstone, with whom he had remained on terms of close friendship since their days together at Oxford. I rejoice, Mr. Gladstone wrote, on your account personally, but more for the sake of the Church. All my brothers-in-law are here, and scarcely less delighted than I am. With great glee am I about to write your new address, but the occasion really calls for higher sentiments, and sure I am that you are one of the men to whom it is especially given to develop the solution of that great problem, how all our minor distractions are to be either abandoned, absorbed, or harmonized through the might of the great principle of communion in the body of Christ. Manning was an archdeacon, but he was not yet out of the wood. His relations with the tractarians had leaked out, and the record was beginning to be suspicious. I'm going to leave it there, and I'll probably read a little bit more tomorrow. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.